Well, welcome McLean Church to this week's talk as we continue our series, 4 Traditions You Can't Live Without. Traditions, they help us manage and make sense of life's most important moments. The collective wisdom of humanity over the ages has given us practices and symbols that help us navigate life at critical points. So whether it's the tradition of a funeral that helps us navigate the death of a loved one, or the tradition of a graduation ceremony that helps us mark the beginning of a new stage of life, traditions give voice to and structure life's pivotal moments. Now, true traditions, healthy traditions, again, they give voice to and structure life's pivotal moments. But unfortunately, it seems that our culture is abandoning meaningful traditions at an unprecedented rate. Every culture abandons some of the traditions it's been given, and that's normal and even necessary. But it seems to me that we're indiscriminately letting go of a lot of the traditions we've received. In the name of efficiency and expediency, we're foregoing the pathway that our traditions provide to help us walk meaningfully and healthily through life's joys and sorrows. And I think it's creating a culture of somewhat unhealthy people. So in this series, we're trying to make the case for traditions, at least some traditions. In this series, we're discussing 4 traditions in particular that go back to and go back even before the time of Jesus. These traditions have helped human beings make sense of life and faith. They've helped people meaningfully travel the road of life. And the 4 traditions we're talking about are: number 1, baptism; 2, communion or Eucharist; 3, weddings; and 4, funerals. Last week we talked about baptism. This week we want to talk about communion, or again, you might know it as the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or the Mass. Communion, it's the remembrance of Jesus, stemming from a meal that he had with his disciples shortly before his death. Communion is certainly a centerpiece of Christian tradition. In fact, some churches observe communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist every time they gather, every single week. Other churches like ours practice communion monthly. The reality is that every Christian church, as far as I know, has a regular practice of observing this tradition. And yet, for as common as it is, I've got to confess, having been a Christian essentially all my life, I've never really understood communion. Now, I don't mean that to be a shock to you. Theologically, I could pass examination questions on the practice. I understand the symbolism and the scriptures behind it, but I've always felt like I never truly got it. I knew this was supposed to be some big, significant celebration. I knew in my head that it was supposed to be deeply moving and deeply meaningful to me. But throughout the majority of my Christian experience, it's really not been that. It's been more confusing, more of a mystery than I think it should have been. Again, I've understood the theology, but I was never able to internalize this practice at the level I felt it should be, or at the level I saw other people seemingly able to internalize and embrace it. So, all that to say, for many years, I was on a quest to try to better understand this ancient tradition, this ancient practice, and to try to understand why it's so central to Christian experience. And I wanted to understand why, in particular, it was so central to the early church. So, of course, to begin that journey, I went back to the beginning, or to the first accounts that we have of people participating in this meal or of observing this tradition. And of course, our earliest accounts or records go back to the Gospels, those 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament that tell us about Jesus celebrating this meal with his disciples. So I want to read to you today from the Gospel of Luke's account of the first communion, the first Lord's Supper, or the Last Supper, as we often talk about it in church history. And after reading this passage, I want to share with you some observations and some conclusions that have helped me better realize and understand what communion was really all about. And I'll hope these observations will help the practice of communion become more meaningful and make more sense to all of us, because my guess is that I'm not the only one who has been a little confused about the significance or practice of this important tradition. So listen to what Luke writes in the 22nd chapter of his gospel. Beginning in verse 14, he says, when the hour came, he, now that's referring to Jesus, took his place at the table and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took the cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Now, at the risk of trying to oversimplify something that is richly complex, I want to suggest that perhaps the key to understanding the power of this tradition that we celebrate, again called the communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, its power is in returning to what it originally was. And what it originally was, as is clear from the text we just read, is it was a meal. What this event that we call communion, the Holy Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, what this event was in its original context, it was a meal, a full meal shared by Jesus and his disciples. If you noted in Luke's account, it mentions 2 cups that are passed. And that little detail is really significant because that detail tells us this was a complete, full meal experience. What we've come to refer to as the Last Supper, which would lead to the practice of communion, it wasn't just a particular moment in a meal. This was the entire meal. And this is how we believe the early church, at least for the first few decades of its existence, if not for centuries, after Jesus died and rose again, this is how the early church celebrated and observed this tradition. They came together and they ate a meal, a full meal, a meal shared together as they spent time together around a table, talking about probably a lot of things besides Jesus and spiritual issues, but remembering that their shared experience was built around and based on Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. This shared community, this shared community experience around a meal That's what communion or the Eucharist or the Lord's table originally was. It was a meal. Now, something changed somewhere during the course of church history. Some scholars put the change around the time of Constantine, when Christianity begins to move toward becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Something happened as the church community moved from a gathering in people's homes to gathering in basilicas or cathedrals. And what happened was, as there was a move from homes into institutional buildings, there was no place to eat a meal together. And so what was once a full meal shared together, it became symbolized and privatized. Symbolized and privatized. The full meal that Jesus experienced with his followers, it was reduced to a token wafer and a swallow from a common cup in some cases. And the experience that was originally a full meal shared together became an individual experience of the individual worshiper as he or she took part or partook of the symbolic elements. And that pattern, it still marks much of our experience of communion to this day. A full meal has become a symbolic meal. A small piece of bread, a small cup of grape juice or wine, or a sip from a common cup. The experience, which was first rooted in a deep sense of community, has become focused on my individual remembrance of or reflection on Jesus and his suffering and death for me. What was once a corporate experience has become a time of individual remembrance. Now, to be sure, this individual remembrance has been very meaningful to many people for centuries. And I don't want to in any way take away from the significance of this symbolic or privatized experience of communion. But I do think we're missing something more. I think we're missing something bigger and greater that was behind Jesus' original intent for this celebration. Because it seems to me, as we reflect on what Jesus did with his disciples and what he asked them to continue to do, and what the early church did for decades, if not centuries, we have to conclude from all this that communion was intended to be a meal with a purpose. And the purpose was to form relationships among people around the reality and image of Christ. Now follow me on this. Jesus asked his followers to remember him in this meal. For us, that's become a cognitive reflection on who Jesus was and what Jesus did. And this is altogether important and appropriate. But there's something much deeper and greater to remembering. To remember is to reconstitute a reality. It is to remember something. And what was the reality of Christ that this meal was designed to remember? The reality of Christ was the community that he created. To remember Christ is to reconstitute that community. To recreate and re-experience the community that his life, death, and resurrection created. And he asked for his followers to remember or recreate that community regularly. How are we to do this? By eating together. Sometimes it feels that churches like ours take on more of a sense of being like theaters or event centers or venues that we come to in order to hear an inspiring talk or listening to engaging music. But it seems that Jesus had a far different vision for his followers or for the church. It wasn't about gathering to observe something. It was about gathering to form, to recreate, to remember, to live out, to live into the community and relationships made possible by the reality that Jesus introduced to the world. And that reality was that in him and through him, there were no longer any differences. No dividing walls between people. All humanity was one, and therefore all people could form community with one another in, around, and through the person of Jesus. And this new community was marked by a significant distinctive. In this new community, everybody, everyone could have a place. Everyone could fit in. Everyone could belong. The church, the community that Jesus envisioned, it was a place where everybody had a seat at the table, where everybody could come to the meal and share a part of it. I wonder if the reason that I and perhaps many of you have long been searching for the hidden power of the celebration of communion is because what we've made communion into, a private remembrance or reflection on the suffering and death of Jesus, is actually not what originally was intended to be. There's something that happens when I gather with other people around the table, and I recognize that those people around the table together with me, I can relate to and connect with because of Jesus Christ. When I do that and have that experience, it makes me aware of, it remembers in my presence, it brings to reality in that moment of time Christ himself. This was certainly one of the ideas behind the 19th century poet and priest Gerard Manley Hopkins' famous poem is Kingfishers Catch Fire. I was only going to read the last section of the poem, which specifically talks about what we're referencing here, but the poem's so good. Give me an extra second to read it in its entirety. Hopkins wrote, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man, justices, keeps grace that keeps all his going graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Hopkins understood what Jesus had in mind when he called his followers to do this in remembrance of him. Jesus understood that he, the Christ, would continually show up in the faces of others. And we would encounter Christ when we looked into the eyes, into the face of those we shared this sacred meal with. Christ would be found in the presence of others that surrounded me around the table, others who were so different in so many ways and levels, but were unified with me in the reality of Christ, this new community where everyone was welcome, everyone was valued, everyone had a seat at the table, everyone belonged. When this community was experienced and recreated, Christ was remembered. Jesus himself said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their presence. Now, if you're part of our online congregation or maybe for a number of reasons you're not able to consistently be present in person with a group to celebrate this sacred meal, please know your private celebration of communion or the Eucharist, it still has great importance, impact, and value. But I want to challenge you today that if your practice of this meal is regularly by yourself, try taking the idea behind this meal a step further to embody this meal's power. Take the initiative at some level, even if it's very small, to begin to engage with the community that surrounds you. Reach out in a text or a phone call or a Facebook message to an old friend that maybe you haven't connected with in a while. Better yet, maybe there's somebody near, a family member, a friend, an acquaintance that you could meet for lunch or dinner or coffee or to go for a walk. If there's no one that you have to connect with today, take a walk and say hi to the person that you pass on the sidewalk or the trail. Begin to recognize that Christ shows up in the presence of others. And there's something about engaging in relationships that forms and remembers Christ in us. There's something about sharing a meal with others that remembers the work Christ came to do. You know, maybe we've just made the whole thing more complicated than it needed to be. Throughout the history of the church, we've argued and debated the details of communion and the precise theology behind it. Maybe Jesus intended it to be as simple as having a meal together, recognizing that in that meal, Christ shows up in our midst. In fact, again, as Hopkins so beautifully stated it, Christ shows up in the very faces of others. To recognize that, to enjoy that, to live into that, maybe that was really what was behind Jesus' words when he instructed us to do this in remembrance of me.